Hey guys, welcome back. In this session, we will learn about declaring variables and different data types in VBA. We will also understand the difference between implicit and explicit declaration. We will look into some commonly used data types. And finally, we'll also know about a keyword called constant. So let's get started. Even before starting on how to declare a variable, let's keep few things in mind before declaring a variable. Number one, your variable name cannot have spaces. For an example, you cannot name your variable as first space name. A valid name should be first name. Similarly, your variable name must not begin with a number. You cannot name your variable as one number. It can be as name one. It can contain a number but should not start with a number. Your variable cannot have a dot symbol. So for example, you can't name your variable as first dot name. You can name it as first underscore name. Dot symbol is not allowed for a variable name. Also, make sure your variable name does not exceed 255 characters. But what is a variable? Variable is an attribute which stores a value. For an example, you want to store a string named Nerdy Nawab. You will need a variable, let's say name. We'll say name is equals to Nerdy Nawab. So basically, variable is an attribute which holds the value. Let's look into what is implicit and what is explicit declaration. When we say implicit, means VBA automatically assigns a data type to a variable. For an example, when you directly say name is equals to Nerdy Nawab, VBA starts treating that object as a string object. So you don't need to declare it, you can directly assign the value to it. Whereas in explicit declaration, you need to first tell us what kind of variable it is. Is it an integer variable? Is it a string variable? Then you can assign a value to it. VBA allows you to have an implicit declaration just because you can have an ease so that without declaring the variable, you can use it throughout your code. Whereas when the code becomes lengthy, you might face in problems, which we'll see in a demo. Let's look at some commonly used data types. Number one is integer. Integer holds the whole number values. Example 55. If you want to store a value something like which has decimal values 55.5, you need to have a variable called double or long or float. Double has the maximum range, so commonly we use double. You can also have a string type of variable which will store a string characters. You can store names, countries, something like that. You can also have a boolean type of variable which holds only two possible values, true or false. Then you have an object. An object can be of anything. It can be an object of a Excel sheet. It can be an object of a different workbook. It can be any object. You might have imported many other references and you want to create an object. So object is a very generic term and can be used across your VBA code to reference different libraries. Let's jump to demo. Let's go to developer tab, click on view code. Let's create our first subroutine. Let's start declaring first an implicit type of variable. Let's say name is equals to, let's print it and see what's the value of it. To run your code, just click on this or F5 from your keyboard. You can see the variable stored Nerdy Nawab and it's able to print the correct value of it. Whereas, as we discussed, the recommended way to use this code is you should use dim name as string. So then this becomes an explicit declaration. So you define the name variable as a type string and then you assign values to it. If you run the code again, you will see similar results. Since the code is small right now, we are not able to see the difference actually. Whereas when the code becomes lengthy, you will realize the importance of explicit declaration. Also, what happens is when you define a variable called name, and it's an implicit type of declaration, and somehow you do a spelling mistake in your code. So this is also considered as a different variable, and when you run the code, you will notice a blank value. VBA is not giving you an error because it considers NME also as a variable which does not have a value yet. So it does not give you an error. However, it does not store a appropriate value to it. So it's advisable to use explicit declaration always. Also, there's an option within Excel which allows you to avoid implicit declaration. On the top of your Excel or your code, you can just write option explicit. Now, this will force you to declare variables every time in an explicit manner. Now, if you try to run this code, you will face an error saying that the variable is not yet declared, variable not defined. In order to run this code, you will need to define a variable explicitly. If you run this code now, you can see the output again. So to avoid the implicit declaration of variables, you can use the option explicit and then declare all your variables. Just to reiterate, VBA allows you to have an implicit variable. However, it's recommended to use explicit variable declaration. Let's also look into different data types and try printing them into message box. Let's take value as integer and assign it as 10. Let's try printing it. You can see the value 10 is printed. If you try to print 10.5 in a day variable, which is an integer type, you will still see it is printing 10. As I mentioned earlier, integer stores the whole numbers. In order to store the decimal values, you should define it as double. Now, when you define the variable as double, it starts showing you the decimal values as well. So, in order to define your variable, you need to understand what kind of data you are trying to put into it. Accordingly, you need to choose the appropriate data type for a particular variable. If you're trying to declare a Boolean variable, you should always assign values like true or false. So that's all about variables and implicit and explicit declarations and different data types in VBA. Let's also look into a keyword called constant in VBA. To have a constant keyword, we should use const, then your variable name. Let's take value is equals to 10. The advantage of using the constant keyword is you cannot change the value of this variable throughout this VBA execution. Simple example, when you don't want to change the value of a variable and use it across, can be number of days in a week, number of days in a year, and things like that. When you want to have a constant specific value and the value does not change during the execution of the program. So you can use a variable called constant. If you try to assign a new value to a constant variable, you will not be able to do it and the VBA will try to throw an error. So when I say constant value is equals to 10, it is taking a value as 10. And when I say value is equals to 20, I'm trying to overwrite a constant variable. If I try to run this now, VBA will show me an error, assignment to constant not permitted, which means I cannot assign the value again to this value variable is already assigned in the statement which says constant variable is equals to 10. If I run this now, it runs without an error. So constants can be assigned values only once. That was all about variables, data types in VBAs, and constant keyword.